Inside the U.S. Capitol, Jasmine Crockett walks into a live hearing and goes straight for Speaker Mike Johnson, targeting one of the most dangerous scandals in modern politics, hidden budgets and unchecked power at the top of the House. Johnson tries to crush her, but minutes later she slams down evidence that blows his defenses apart. The chamber explodes. Johnson locks up. Millions watch as the mask of power rips away. When the truth detonates, can the guilty still cling to control, or is this the moment everything falls? Stay with us, this is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing room was a pressure cooker, the hum of cameras loud enough to scrape nerves raw. Every seat was filled, staffers, reporters, lawmakers, all facing a long table that looked less like a workspace and more like a battlefield. The air had that metallic bite like the split second before a storm hits. At the far end, Jasmine Crockett sat in the last chair, her microphone angled just out of reach, a subtle sabotage. Her papers were stacked with precision, her stare locked on the opposite end. In politics, even where you sit is a weapon, and her tiny nameplate seemed almost swallowed by the distance to the chairman's seat, a throne waiting for its occupant. The side door swung open and Mike Johnson entered like a man stepping onto a stage he'd built himself. His suit was razor sharp, his smile steeped in arrogance. The applause from Republicans rolling in like a drumbeat of power. He didn't hurry, he owned the moment, eyes sweeping the room as if measuring his territory. Cameras crowd, then finally Jasmine, his gaze lingering just long enough to throw down a silent challenge. A smirk curled at the edge of his mouth. I run this room. When he took his seat, the clapping stopped, but the air only grew heavier, as if everyone knew they were seconds away from a collision that couldn't be undone. The weight in the room hadn't lifted since Mike Johnson took his seat. It had only shifted, pressing harder now, like the air before a lightning strike. Jasmine adjusted her papers, leaning in toward the microphone, her voice just finding its rhythm when 6 words in Johnson sliced across her sentence. His tone was casual on the surface, but sharpened underneath, the kind of delivery meant to sting in public. Sorry, he said, letting the pause hang long enough for the cameras to catch it. This is Congress, not a TikTok stage. The words hit the chamber like a slap, eliciting a few muffled chuckles from his side. He didn't give her time to recover. You're just an amateur congresswoman who doesn't understand budget law and is chasing cheap fame. He continued, leaning back in his chair as if the matter were already settled. The Republican benches broke into a low, knowing laugh, short-clipped, almost rehearsed each sound, reinforcing the wall he was trying to build around her. Jasmine didn't move, didn't blink. Her fingers stayed lightly pressed on the stack of documents before her, but the stillness in her body was coiled deliberate. Her eyes locked on Johnson, cold and unyielding, carrying the kind of weight that doesn't need volume to be felt. It was the look of someone who'd taken a hit but refused to step back, someone measuring every inch of the field before striking. No rebuttal came from her lips, only the controlled silence of a person who knew that words, if used too soon, could lose their edge. Around them, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, the air tightening, as if everyone present could sense that his attack had landed, but not in the way he intended. This wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. The low ripple of laughter from the Republican side had barely died when the chair recognized Jasmine. She didn't rush. She sat back for half a second, then pushed her shoulders, square spine straightening, as if anchoring herself into the seat. One hand rested on her stack of documents, the other adjusting the mic with deliberate care, pulling it toward her, until her voice would carry to every corner of the chamber and straight into the cameras. When she began speaking, her tone was slow, measured, and unshakable, each word carved clean through the tension in the air. I'm not here to put on a show, Jasmine said, her gaze fixed directly on Mike Johnson, not blinking once. I'm here to expose those who turn the law into a shield for corruption. The line landed heavy, drawing a subtle shift in the room's energy like a drumbeat before a charge. Mike's reaction was instant, a low dismissive chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, one arm slung lazily across the armrest, projecting the casual arrogance of a man who thought the outcome was already written. If you truly have evidence, go ahead, Mike said, dragging out the pause just long enough to turn it into a taunt. But I suspect you don't even understand what a budget appendix is. A faint ripple of smirks passed down the Republican benches, their eyes darting between the two, like spectators at the opening round of a prize fight. Jasmine didn't look away. Her jaw tightened by the smallest fraction, her expression holding steady, but the steel in her stare made it clear his words hadn't landed where he thought. In that moment, the hearing room wasn't just a forum, it was a fault line, and both of them knew it was about to crack. He had mocked her command of numbers, scoffed at her understanding of procedure, but Jasmine Crockett didn't come armed with rhetoric. She came armed with receipts. Jasmine didn't speak right away. She let the weight of his insults settle, let the smugness linger just long enough to sharpen the contrast. Then without theatrics, she reached for the folder in front of her. Her fingers moved deliberately, not rushed, not nervous like someone setting the final piece in place. She slid a document onto the table and tapped twice. Behind her, the tech assistant responded instantly. The room dimmed slightly as the screen at the front of the chamber came to life, not with an opinion, not with a speech, but with hard, unrelenting data. Government seal, time-stamped, verified by the Office of the Inspector General, and across the screen rows of transactions spilled out in quiet devastation. Jasmine spoke evenly, almost too calmly. This document is a financial audit conducted by the OIG. It outlines a pattern of disbursements totaling $93 million, all routed through expedited infrastructure funds under Section 17B funds that on paper were meant for emergency response. The screen scrolled. 3 names appeared, each tied to companies with nondescript titles and no public-facing operations. Each company had appeared only once on a federal contract, and all 3, as the audit showed, shared direct ties to a single individual, Grant Holland. Mr. Holland, Jasmine continued, still staring forward, has been a campaign strategist, private consultant, and personal friend to Speaker Johnson for over a decade. These companies list him as either executive officer or major shareholder. In all 3 cases, the funds arrived within 10 days of his meetings with the Speaker's office. The room had turned to stone. Republicans, moments earlier, full of laughter and posture, now sat motionless. One congressman rubbed his temple. Another shuffled papers just to avoid looking up. The air itself had changed, less oxygen, more pressure. Johnson didn't interrupt. He couldn't. His expression hadn't changed much, but the tell was there, one twitch in the corner of his jaw, one blink too slow. Jasmine let the moment breathe. The contracts were hidden in an appendix most members never reviewed. No bidding process, no oversight. Just signatures, she said, tapping the document again, and silence. Then she turned her gaze directly to him. I may not have a long title, but I read every line they thought I'd skip. Her tone never wavered. She didn't need volume. She had something better, evidence that didn't blink, didn't lie, didn't flinch. And as the numbers continued scrolling across the screen, like a silent indictment, it was no longer Jasmine Crockett who had to prove herself. It was Mike Johnson who couldn't afford to speak. The evidence hit like a hammer, clean cold, no wiggle room. But when truth corners power, it rarely bows. It roars. Mike Johnson jerked forward in his chair, composure cracking in full view of the cameras. The polished statesman from minutes ago vanished, and a rattled man took his place, trying to hide fear behind volume. His voice jumped sharp enough to sting. You are disgracing this chamber, he shouted, the words bouncing off marble, as if force could replace proof. This isn't oversight. It's an attack on the integrity of this institution. It's reckless. It's fabricated. It's beneath the dignity of Congress. His palm hit the desk for emphasis, but the slight tremor in his hand told a truer story. This is a political stunt, he pushed on, jabbing a finger at the screen, a smear built on loose numbers and cherry-picked contracts. The cadence gave him away. He wasn't answering the claim, he was trying to drown it. He fixed his stare on Jasmine like intimidation could substitute for an argument. You are turning this hall into a theater of lies. Congresswoman, he said, pressing the attack as if speed might erase context. You're twisting numbers. You don't understand, to push a false narrative and poison this chamber with conspiracy and ego. The edge of his voice wobbled barely, but enough that the room heard it. For a flicker of a second, the mask slipped and the power dynamic flipped. The noise wasn't authority anymore. It was panic pretending to be control. Eyes in the gallery cut to Jasmine, waiting not for a counterpunch, but for the cut that ends the round. The applause lines were gone. The air had changed teams. The question wasn't whether she would respond, it was how. Jasmine didn't sprint to the mic. She let the quiet do some work. The pause stretched just long enough for the adrenaline to settle and focus to snap back to her. When she finally spoke, there was no heat, only precision. If this is all just conjecture, Mr. Speaker, then why did you sign off on those transfers without any audit documentation on file? She asked, voice even, words trimmed to the bone. It wasn't an insult. It was a pin pushed exactly where it hurts. The line didn't invite debate. It demanded an answer. The temperature dropped a degree. Pens froze over notepads. The red flow of funds still glowed behind her, but now the camera frames belonged to him. 5 slow seconds passed, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the man who usually owned the room had nothing. When he finally found a sentence, it came out smaller than he needed. Because I trust my technical staff, he said, and even he seemed to hear how thin it sounded. It was a placeholder, the kind of line that fills time, but solves nothing. Jasmine didn't waste a breath. She lifted a single sheet crisp and clean and handed it to the clerk. The camera zoomed in as the page reached the dais speaker's letterhead at the top, a short paragraph in the center, and an unmistakable signature at the bottom. Below the signature sat a handwritten direction sharp enough to read from the gallery, "Proceed immediately. Do not delay with formal review." The reaction wasn't loud. It was a soft collective intake of air, the kind that says the room recognizes a door has just closed. This wasn't buried in staff work or lost in a stack. It was direct. It had a name. She didn't smile, didn't spike the ball. Control is quieter than that. This note bypassed standard oversight protocol, Jasmine said, eyes locked on his. It was issued before any supporting documentation from the subcommittees and overrode caution flags raised by your own compliance unit. So let me ask again, was this the work of your technical staff, or was this your decision? The tone never wavered. It didn't need to. One Republican glanced at the page and looked away fast, as if eye contact could implicate him. Another folded his arms, lips pressed into a thin line, retreating behind silence. Johnson stared at the document, but didn't reach for it, pinned by the very process he once wielded like a weapon. Every lens in the room stayed on his face. Every reporter leaned forward, already knowing this wasn't a back and forth anymore. This was a reckoning captured live. Jasmine eased back into her seat without breaking eye contact. You questioned whether I understood the appendix, she said, calm and final. I read it, every word, every footnote, every buried clause. While you counted on everyone else skipping the fine print, I kept going. And in that beat, the outsider wasn't her. It was Mike Johnson, isolated, exposed, and sitting under a truth he could no longer control. The signature rattled him, but Jasmine knew paper wouldn't finish it. She needed something no one could argue with his voice. After the document, the room held still for a beat. One breath. In that small pause, Jasmine calmly tapped the black device beside her. The overhead screen changed. Spreadsheets and memos disappeared. A dark screen with a pulsing waveform took their place. No music, no preface. Half a second of static, then a voice. Male, even, controlled. And clearly Mike Johnson. The public doesn't need the details, he said, sounding casual like a side conversation. Inside the chamber, it landed like a bomb. They're too busy trying to pay off student loans and gas bills to care where the money goes. We tuck it into line items. Nobody asks, nobody reads. The lines hit hard, not spin, not someone else's summary. His own voice, clean, direct, recorded. The room that once applauded him now had to listen to him unfiltered. At first, there wasn't a shout or an outburst, just a sharp stillness, as if everyone was checking they'd heard right. Then it cracked, quick gasps, tight breaths. A Democrat near Johnson whispered, "Jesus." Another member leaned toward a staffer, hand over their mouth. Jasmine stayed quiet. She didn't need to add anything. Silence did the work. The voice kept rolling, slow and damning. We don't need them to understand it. We just need them to forget it. That's when the room truly shifted. Phones came out this time from lawmakers, Democrats, independents, 2 Republicans too. They weren't chasing a headline. They were saving evidence. What played wasn't opinion, it was a plan, not carelessness intent. The kind of behind-the-door talk people suspect, but don't expect to hear. And now it was echoing through Congress in the speaker's own voice. Jasmine didn't move. Arms at her sides, face steady, eyes fixed on Johnson. His eyes stayed on the screen. For the first time all day, his hands were still. His jaw stopped working. His back went rigid like a chill had run through him. He wasn't being accused anymore. He was being replayed, his words back at him in a form he couldn't shout down. Up in the gallery, a reporter dropped a pen. Another whispered into a recorder with a shaking voice. The hearing wasn't just a hearing now. It was a break in the surface. The unspoken deal between those in charge and those watching had torn in real time. They won't read the appendix, his recorded voice added. They never do. That's the point. That line drew a clear reaction. A few Republicans whispered. Some leaned back uneasy. Others froze eyes wide, waiting for someone to step in and stop it. Jasmine didn't stop it. She let all 23 seconds run. When it ended, the quiet wasn't just heavy, it was choking. No counter-argument, no talking points. Just the echo of what everyone had heard. She stepped to the mic without urgency, more weight than heat. This isn't about miscommunication, she said. It's about manipulation, calculated, admitted, and now recorded. There was nothing to add. For the first time all day, Mike Johnson had nothing left to hide behind. No title, no process, no denial. Only silence. His own. Johnson's voice was still hanging in the air when the old playbook kicked in, stall delay, buy time. The move came quick, wrapped in calm words but full of urgency. Congressman Rhodes, one of Johnson's closest allies, adjusted his tie, leaned into the mic, and spoke like a man running damage control. Mr. Chairman, he began, voice a little rough, given the nature of what's just been presented and the need to ensure fairness. I request that we recess this hearing until the audio can be independently verified. On paper, it sounded reasonable. In reality, everyone knew what it meant. Retreat, delay, hope the story dies down. Before the air could settle, Congresswoman Laird jumped in. Her voice was tight eyes flicking to the press gallery. This is a serious accusation, she said. We shouldn't move forward under the shadow of unverified recordings. Neither of them was doubting the evidence, they were protecting themselves. The room stirred. Aides whispered into headsets. Some members leaned back quietly, relieved at the idea of a break. The pressure had been suffocating, and here was the escape hatch. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't letting them use it. She stood calm, steady, and said one word. No, procedural talk. No wiggle room, just a flat refusal. Then she turned to the committee. Today, the American people are watching, she said. Not tomorrow. Not after a weekend of press releases. Now. Her voice stayed even, but it cut straight through the noise. We're not pausing the truth because it's uncomfortable. We're not burying this under subpoenas and committee referrals. She took a short breath. I will not yield. Not when the highest office in this House is implicated. Not when corruption hides behind red tape. Not when millions of Americans have been told over and over that no one listens. The room was quiet again, not from fear but from focus. She wasn't debating anymore. She was drawing a line, and she wasn't done. Jasmine reached for another folder, thicker, clipped with a red paper clip, and opened it. No build-up, no long intro. She slid 4 printed pages across the table. With a signal to the tech staff, the pages appeared on the big screen one by one, each marked with the office of the speaker's header, dated and routed through official channels. These, she said, are internal communications from the speaker's own office. Not rumors, not hearsay. Direct messages between senior staff moving money through undisclosed third parties. The first email was simple but clear. Vendor diversion, confirmation. Keep external. The body read, move total via grants vehicle. Avoid naming until Q3. Use legacy pack format if questioned. Jasmine looked at the panel. This isn't oversight. This is a roadmap. The second email popped up coordinate shell invoices with Holland before disclosure deadline. Confirm Johnson's sign-off. Jasmine pointed to it. That sign-off isn't a guess, it's dated, and it matches the document already in evidence. Then came the third, a budget chart labeled Channel Masking Options. Compliant presentation. She highlighted a line split into three firms to avoid thresholds. Rotate signatories. Cold technical and written for people who never thought it would leave a closed room. Finally, the fourth email speaker approved. Proceed. Same structure as February. Jasmine didn't need to raise her voice. The words on the screen did the work. These aren't misunderstandings, she said. They're instructions. This wasn't just moving money, it was laundering it through politics buried under paperwork shielded by his title. The room stayed silent. Not the kind of silence that means nothing to say the kind that means everyone knows the weight of what they've just heard. Johnson didn't speak. Couldn't. In a matter of minutes, he'd gone from the man in control to the man under fire. And Jasmine Crockett, standing firm, never looked away. The evidence was still hanging heavy in the air when Mike's control finally snapped. The crack of his palm slamming down on the desk exploded through the chamber like a gunshot, the sound ricocheting off the wood and glass. Papers jumped, a water glass rattled against its saucer, and heads in the gallery jerked toward him. His face was tight, jaw-locked eyes burning not with measured authority, but with the kind of anger that comes when cornered. He leaned forward over the microphone's shoulders, hunched like a man ready to charge and let it rip. Who let you drag this garbage in here? This is where laws are made, not a stage show. The roar didn't just fill the room, it hit the walls and bounced back at him, magnifying the rawness in his voice. Staffers froze mid-note, unsure whether to keep writing or look away. On the Republican side, a few members shifted in their seats, some trying to hide the unease creeping up their spines. The microphones caught everything, the tremor in his breathing, the scrape of his chair legs against the floor. The cameras stayed locked on his face, framing every flicker of frustration, every tightening muscle in his jaw. This wasn't the calm, strategic speaker who opened the hearing. This was a man bleeding authority in front of the nation. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't even lean back. Instead, she sat as still as a stone, her expression a study in control. Then, with the kind of composure that cuts sharper than volume, the corner of her mouth curled into a small, deliberate smile. The smile wasn't gloating, it was a message. You don't scare me. Not now, not ever. Slowly, she leaned toward her microphone, the movement steady, unhurried, as if every second of silence belonged to her. Her voice came out low but carried clean across the room, slicing through the lingering echo of his outburst. If you think the truth is garbage, maybe you've never made law, she said. The words didn't shake, didn't spike. They landed flat and solid like a weight dropped exactly where it needed to be. Her eyes never left him, pinning him to his seat. You're just buying time before your own collapse. The line was a blade, no wasted words, no room for him to twist it. It wasn't about winning the point. It was about drawing the line in front of the entire chamber. And in that moment, she owned the room. A subtle ripple moved through the audience, an exhale from those who'd been holding their breath. On his side of the dais, a staffer's pen froze mid-scribble. On hers, a colleague leaned back, hands folded, eyes locked on the speaker, like they'd just witnessed a shift in gravity. Mike's hand stayed planted on the desk knuckles, pale against the polished wood. He didn't pull it back. He didn't speak. The cameras caught it all the way his jaw worked without producing words, the way his shoulders squared, as if bracing for something heavier than the paper trail already on the screen. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded, coiled tight, waiting for the next move. But for now, it was hers. Jasmine had stepped into the space he tried to take from her and filled it completely. Every eye in the room knew it. This wasn't just a sharp exchange in a heated hearing. It was a pivot point, and the balance of control had just shifted, not with shouting or spectacle, but with one calm voice refusing to be pushed aside. The tension from Jasmine's last line hadn't faded. It was still hanging over the chamber, like heavy smoke when the next move came. The air was so still you could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights, and then from the far left section of the dais, the sound of a chair pushing back broke through. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't timid, it was deliberate. Every head turned as an independent congressman, a man known for keeping his cards close until the stakes were highest, rose to his feet. His gaze didn't wander. It scanned once slowly across the panel and the gallery before fixing directly on the dais where Mike Johnson sat. There was no hesitation in his voice, no political fluff, no procedural throat clearing. I move for an immediate investigation into the Speaker of the House. The words dropped into the room like a steel weight hitting a hardwood floor. No one asked him to repeat it. No one misheard. The statement was so clear, so direct, that it seemed to strip away the cushion of parliamentary politeness. For a fraction of a second, there was only stillness, like the chamber itself was processing the fact that someone had just turned the hearing from oversight into something far more dangerous. And then the reaction hit. It started in the press gallery. Reporters jolted forward, their hands moving instinctively, pens scratching in notebooks, camera shutters clicking in fast bursts, phone screens lighting up as they began typing the blue glow reflecting off their glasses. One correspondent mouthed something to another too fast to catch, but both of them leaned toward the edge of the gallery rail as if proximity could get them closer to the story. In the back rows, aides in dark suits lowered their heads toward the earpieces curled in their collars, murmuring to unseen voices on the other end. A ripple ran through the room, not noise exactly, but movement, the subtle shift of people recalculating in real time what this meant for the man at the center table. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She stayed in her seat, hands resting lightly on the table, her posture unchanged. She didn't smile, didn't lean back in satisfaction. This wasn't her victory lap. It was the next step in a process she had controlled since she dropped the first piece of evidence. Her stillness contrasted with the storm she'd just helped create, and that contrast only made her look more in command. The cameras swung to Mike Johnson. The lens found him fast framing his face in tight focus. This was the shot they wanted, the speaker's reaction to the most direct challenge he'd faced all day, maybe all year. But there was no verbal counter, no quick jab. Instead, something else happened. Mike Johnson's shoulders sank almost imperceptibly at first, like the air had gone out of him. His chin lowered, breaking eye contact with the room. His hands, which had been clenched around a pen minutes earlier, relaxed and folded loosely in front of him on the desk. For the first time all day, he didn't fill the silence with his voice. He didn't attempt to reclaim the floor, to redirect, to launch into one of his long, layered speeches that mixed procedure with defiance. He just sat there. The absence of his voice was almost louder than his earlier outbursts. People in the chamber members' staff press recognized it instantly. This was the first time in the entire hearing that Mike Johnson had nothing to say. Not because he wasn't allowed, not because someone else was speaking, but because the weight of the evidence and the motion just made against him had left him with nothing that could stand up under the lights. The press gallery knew it too. That's why within minutes, headlines began flashing on phone screens across the room. Jasmine Crockett leaves Mike Johnson speechless with evidence he can't deny. Independent motion for investigation. Rocks House hearing. Speaker silent after damning call for immediate probe. From the corner of the room, a staff photographer snapped a wide shot, the chamber, the rows of members, and in the center, the Speaker of the House with his head lowered. The image would be on front pages before the day was out. Johnson's allies glanced at each other, some leaning in to whisper, others simply avoiding eye contact altogether. Their faces gave them away. They weren't rallying to defend him. They were assessing the damage. A few Republican members who had been quick to back him earlier in the session now stared straight ahead, their expressions locked somewhere between discomfort and calculation. One seat over, a Democratic member scribbled something on a legal pad, tore the page out, folded it once, and slid it toward a colleague without looking up. Across the aisle, another lawmaker, normally stone-faced, tapped a pen against his thumb in a slow, rhythmic beat, his eyes fixed on Johnson like he was watching a man run out of rope. The chamber's energy had shifted entirely. 10 minutes earlier, Johnson had been fighting to command the space. Now the space was closing in on him. Jasmine remained still, but she wasn't passive. Her silence wasn't the silence of someone finished. It was the silence of someone letting the weight of the moment sink into every corner of the room. She didn't need to add to it. The call for an investigation had already lit the fuse. And while Johnson didn't speak, his body language was saying plenty. The tilt of his head, the slope of his shoulders, the way his hands stayed flat on the desk instead of gesturing. All of it read like a man suddenly aware that the ground beneath him had shifted and that no amount of procedure or bluster could put it back the way it was. A low murmur rolled through the press section as another wave of updates hit the wires. Screens in the gallery glowed with the latest bulletins, breaking motion filed for immediate investigation into House Speaker. Every update carried Jasmine's name alongside his, framing the confrontation not as a partisan squabble, but as a moment of accountability caught live in front of the nation. The speaker still hadn't moved. The gavel sat in front of him, untouched, its handle catching the light from the overhead fixtures. For all its symbolic power, it looked small now, like a tool he no longer knew how to use. In the quiet, you could almost feel the collective awareness in the room. This was more than just another heated exchange in a congressional hearing. This was the kind of moment that lives beyond the day's agenda, the kind that makes the record books and the campaign ads. Jasmine finally allowed herself a slow breath, her eyes steady on the man across from her. She didn't have to say a word. The motion had been made. The press had seized it. The speaker had gone silent. And in that silence, the balance of power in the room had shifted permanently. The room had fallen into a strange, heavy silence after the independent representative's demand for an immediate investigation. It wasn't the kind of quiet that fades quickly. It was the kind that lingered, wrapping itself around every corner of the chamber. That was when the media outside and in the gallery above moved in like a second wave, ready to turn the moment into something larger than the four walls could hold. By the time the first press release hit the wire, the headline was already sharpened to cut through the noise. The Capitol collapse, silence at the top. It wasn't a metaphor. It was exactly what had happened. One man, the Speaker of the House, had been stripped of the most valuable weapon in politics, his voice. The footage showed it clearly: Jasmine Crockett, standing firm, evidence still glowing on the overhead screen, and Mike Johnson frozen in his chair, jaw-locked, eyes lowered as if trying to find the floor that had just given way beneath him. The phrase, "the Capitol collapse," caught on instantly. Anchors repeated it with the precision of a verdict. Pundits dissected it like forensic evidence. It wasn't just about the hearing anymore. It was about the symbolism. Here was the highest-ranking member of the House, the man who controlled the legislative calendar, the gavel, the agenda, and for those 20 unbearable seconds he had nothing. No rebuttal, no counterattack, no procedural trick to break the momentum. Just a still frame of a leader watching his own political foundation erode in real time. The clips were already running on every major network, split screen with the damning audio and the printed emails Jasmine had laid out. The slow, deliberate collapse of his posture told the story even better than the words. Inside the Capitol, the ripple effects were immediate. Hallway conversations turned into whispered strategy sessions. Staffers who had spent years guarding Johnson's image were now avoiding eye contact, their phones buzzing nonstop with calls from donors, committee chairs, and party operatives. Some were being told to stand by others to create distance, and a few were told outright to start looking at other offices. The machinery of political survival was shifting gears, but this time it wasn't moving in his direction. The hearing might have been the spark, but it was the stillness, the image of a man who couldn't speak, that made the fire impossible to put out. By the afternoon, statements from advocacy groups and watchdog organizations began to pile up. Some were careful, using phrases like deep concern and unacceptable if true, but others didn't bother with caution. The National Integrity Forum released a blunt three-line statement. The evidence presented is clear. The Speaker's position is compromised. We call for his resignation. Within hours, similar demands came from multiple directions: nonprofits, civic coalitions, and even a handful of local chambers of commerce who rarely weighed in on national politics. For them, it wasn't about partisanship. It was about the optics of power being caught red-handed and then standing there silent. Cable news producers started booking panels before the sunset. The phrase, "the Capitol collapse," was now a chyron stamped in bold red across the bottom of the screen. Footage of Johnson's lowered head ran on loop. One commentator summed it up in a single sentence: "It's not the evidence alone, it's the look on his face when he realized the room had turned." And that's what was haunting him now. Every angle of that moment had been captured: the shift in his shoulders, the stillness of his hands, the slight downward tilt of his head that suggested not defiance, but recognition. Back in his office, the pressure was reaching a breaking point. Johnson's inner circle had shrunk to a handful of loyalists, most of whom were now speaking in short, clipped sentences. They didn't need to spell it out. He could see it in their eyes. This wasn't just damage control. This was triage. Each phone call brought another crack in the dam: a committee ally announcing they could no longer defend him on air, a donor requesting clarity before next quarter, a state party chair expressing profound disappointment. The walls were closing in, and the echo of his own silence from that chamber was following him into every room. Outside the steps of the Capitol had become a stage. Protesters, small in number, at first began to gather with hastily made signs. No one above accountability and resign now. Journalists circled them for quotes while photographers snapped wide shots to capture the marble backdrop against the human voices calling for change. The air was thick with the kind of anticipation that builds before a major break in the story. Everyone was waiting to see if Johnson would respond, but the more he stayed silent, the more the silence itself became the story. Editorial boards began weighing in. The Washington Sentinel ran an op-ed under the headline, "A Speaker Without a Voice Cannot Lead." The National Chronicle was even harsher, writing, "In the theater of politics, the rarest thing is unscripted truth. This week we saw it, and it left our highest-ranking legislator speechless. That silence is more revealing than any speech he could have given." Each piece only tightened the vice around him, feeding a narrative that had already broken containment. By the end of the day, it was no longer just the opposition speaking out. A few members of his own party, careful to frame their words as concern rather than condemnation, began suggesting that the institution might be better served by new leadership. In Washington, that's the political equivalent of smelling smoke before the fire alarm sounds. Jasmine hadn't just challenged his actions, she had triggered a shift in how power was willing to stand next to him. The Capitol hadn't literally collapsed, but for Mike Johnson, the structure he had built his career on was cracking in plain view. The moment had a name now, and names have power. The Capitol collapse wasn't just a headline, it was a verdict delivered by 1,000 voices at once. And as more organizations joined the call for his resignation, the reality became harder to outrun. The silence that had protected him in the chamber was now the same silence drowning him outside it. The call for Johnson's resignation was still hanging in the air, like the echo of a gunshot, when the reality of what had just happened began to spread. Inside the Capitol, people moved with the dazed pace of those leaving a stadium after a championship upset, each carrying their own replay of the moment in their heads. But outside, the impact had already gone national. By dawn the next morning, the data was clear. Jasmine Crockett was officially the most searched name in America within a 24-hour period. Not trending, not buzzing, this was something else. This was fixation. Her name had cut across the noise of everything else happening in the country and claimed the top slot with a margin so wide it looked unreal on the analytics dashboards. In kitchens, office break rooms, gas stations, and gym locker rooms, people were talking about her. People who didn't know who the Speaker of the House was last week now knew exactly what she looked like, how she spoke, and the moment she refused to yield. In diners, the conversations kept starting the same way. "Did you see her?" The pronoun was enough. They didn't have to say her name because everyone at the table already knew who they meant. Someone would hold up a phone, and heads would tilt toward the screen like moths drawn to a street lamp. There was no need for explanation. The video was its own language. The footage itself had become almost mythic in speed. In the clip, she didn't lean forward like a brawler or pace like a debater. She stood still, anchored, letting her words carry weight without wasted motion. Johnson, by contrast, seemed to fold in on himself in real time. There was no sudden collapse, no dramatic storm out. It was worse. It was the stillness of a man who had just realized the walls were closer than he thought. That contrast was the visual hook, and news producers understood it instinctively. By the second morning, nearly every major network had the same split screen, cued on one side Jasmine upright and calm. On the other, Johnson's shoulders slightly hunched, gaze lowered just enough for the cameras to catch it. No Chiron needed. The image told the whole story. The headlines wrote themselves. Crockett freezes the Speaker. The moment the House stopped, from Texas to the top, Crockett redefines the floor. Morning shows rolled the tape at half speed, their analysts narrating like sports commentators breaking down a championship play. "Watch the pause here," one said, freezing the frame just as she held his gaze. That's where the power shifts. She's not filling the silence, she's letting him live in it. Viewers at home didn't need to be told what they were seeing. They could feel it. But the story didn't just live on cable news. Push notifications blared across phones before people had even finished their morning coffee. Airport terminals showed the moment on silent loops. In barbershops, customers sat with capes around their necks, glued to small wall-mounted TVs replaying the scene. At a truck stop outside Nashville, the cashier had the video running on an old desktop monitor behind the counter, and even the truckers who claimed to avoid politics stood watching until the clip finished. And then there was the internet, faster, sharper, more ruthless than any broadcast cycle. The clip was everywhere at once. It appeared on timelines without commentary, just raw footage. It appeared with captions in bold letters, freeze-framing the moment she delivered her line. It appeared as GIFs looping the second she raised her chin over and over like a visual drumbeat. Memes sprouted in hours, but unlike most political memes, these weren't mocking. They were celebratory, reverent even. One viral tweet simply posted the split screen with the caption, "This is what holding your ground looks like." It racked up hundreds of thousands of likes in a single afternoon. What struck people wasn't just what she said, but how she said it. She didn't bury her point under legalese or political theater. She spoke plainly in a way that didn't require translation. There was no ramp-up, no fluff, just direct confrontation, framed in terms anyone could understand. For millions of viewers, that stripped away every excuse to look away. They didn't need context to know what they were watching. They could see a man with one of the most powerful titles in Washington come up empty, and a woman who refused to give him a step of ground. By midday, it was clear this had broken containment. Editorial boards debated whether to label her a truth teller, a disruptor, or both. Talk radio hosts who had spent years mocking congressional hearings as political theater were now playing the audio on repeat, calling it the most honest exchange you'll hear this year. Even corners of the political spectrum that had no love for her policies admitted grudgingly that she had owned the moment. Her district back in Texas felt the aftershock immediately. Staffers arriving at her local office found reporters already camped on the sidewalk. Volunteers who had worked her campaign said their phones were blowing up with calls from strangers in other states offering donations time or just words of support. Constituents were telling stories of their own, saying her defiance felt like it belonged to them too, that for once someone in that building had spoken without folding it into a careful calculation. Meanwhile, Johnson's allies were facing a grim calculus. The visual imbalance was impossible to escape. The frozen frame, her steady, unblinking stare against his hesitant posture, wasn't just a bad angle. It was narrative. It suggested surrender without anyone needing to say the word. In a city built on perception, that was more dangerous than any single accusation. A dozen loyal surrogates tried to hit the talk show circuit to reframe it, but every appearance was undermined by the constant cutaways to the footage. We're talking about one moment one began on live TV only for the host to interrupt, "Yes, this moment," and play the clip again. For the viewing public, it didn't matter how many times they had already seen it, they kept watching. They studied her timing, her control, the precision with which she let silence do half the work. They noticed the small things, the way her fingers rested lightly on the desk, instead of clenching, the way her eyes didn't flick away. When Johnson shifted in his seat, the way she seemed to lean into stillness rather than fill it. These were the details that stuck. By the time the 24-hour mark hit, her name had pulled so far ahead in search rankings that the competition looked absurd. The second most searched name in America wasn't even close. Analysts on media panels pointed out that her spike outpaced celebrity scandals, sports championships, and even breaking news on the economy. This wasn't curiosity, it was impact. People weren't just looking her up for entertainment. They were looking her up to understand what had just shifted in the balance of political power. And yet, for all the saturation, the image itself didn't lose its power. Whether it was playing on a phone in a crowded subway car or on a massive screen in Times Square, it carried the same jolt, a moment in which the hierarchy flipped and the room knew it. It was the kind of political moment that becomes a reference point, the kind that's replayed years later in documentaries with voiceovers saying, "This was the turning point." In living rooms across the country, people kept the volume low, but their eyes locked. In offices, someone would say, "Just one more time," and they'd all gather around the same laptop screen to watch it again. It wasn't just politics, it was something rarer, a shared, unfiltered moment that cut through the static of everything else competing for attention. By the end of that day, the story wasn't just that Jasmine Crockett had faced down the Speaker of the House, it was that the nation had stopped to watch her do it. For 24 hours, no other name loomed larger. Her rise to the most searched person in America wasn't about algorithms or trends. It was about resonance. In a country full of noise, she had delivered a moment so sharp, so precise, that it became impossible to ignore. The roar of the cameras had faded. The headlines were already cementing their own version of events. But beneath the noise, there was something else, quieter, heavier, and far more important. The real story was no longer just about one exchange on the House floor. It was about what that moment revealed: the fragile line between power and accountability, and the courage it takes to step across it. In that instant, Jasmine hadn't just called out a man, she had called out a system. She had shown that the titles, the ornate chambers, the rules of order, they mean nothing if they're used to shield the truth. And in doing so, she had reminded an entire country of something we keep forgetting. The institutions we fear or revere are not alive. The people inside them are, which means they can fail, they can betray, and if confronted, they can also change. That was the pulse beneath the applause, the thing that would still matter long after the trending charts cooled. For every person who watched that clip and saw politics, there was someone else who saw their own life in it. They saw the boss who thought they could humiliate an employee and get away with it. They saw the neighbor who used their influence to bend the rules. They saw the family member who assumed silence was the same as agreement. And in Jasmine's steady voice, they saw the answer they had wanted to give for years but never could. "If you think the truth is garbage," she had said, "then maybe you've never made a law. You've only bought yourself more time before the collapse." That line wasn't just about Johnson. It was about every abuse of authority that survives because people are too tired, too afraid, or too cornered to speak up. For once, someone had spoken, and she hadn't just spoken for herself. She had spoken for the room, for the country, for the countless faces watching through glass and screens. It was a reminder that courage isn't always loud, but it is always visible. People could feel the difference between a staged outburst and a genuine stand. What made this moment dangerous to the comfortable was that it didn't feel rehearsed, it felt necessary. There was no smug smirk, no fist pump for the cameras, no cheap victory lap. Just the calm certainty of someone who knows that the truth once said out loud cannot be taken back. That is why it rattled so deeply, because it wasn't a soundbite to be forgotten. It was a mirror, and it didn't care who was standing in front of it. Mirrors have no favorites. They just show what's there. And for the first time in a long time, the American public saw their leaders without the coat of polish. Some flinched. Others leaned closer. The human lesson here wasn't about political rivalry. It was about the price of silence. The country has been taught to treat truth like a dangerous weapon, something to handle only in private behind closed doors. But truth is not fragile. It doesn't crack when exposed. What cracks is the illusion built to hide it. That's why people in power fear it. It's not the noise of truth that scares them. It's the way it dismantles their architecture in seconds. When Jasmine stood there and refused to fold, she wasn't rewriting the rules, she was showing what the rules should have been all along. She was proof that the right words at the right time can pierce through every layer of spin and land exactly where they need to in the conscience of anyone listening. There's a dangerous myth we've let fester that leadership means being unchallengeable, that if someone has the title, they have the right to dictate the truth. But leadership in its purest form is service, and service means you can be questioned. It means you should be questioned. That is why the sight of Johnson, silent and staring down at his desk, struck such a nerve. It wasn't just that he looked defeated, it was that for once the hierarchy had been reversed. The most powerful person in the room had to answer, not dictate. And that shift, even if temporary, gave people watching a glimpse of what accountability might look like if it were more than a slogan. If there's one thing the scene should teach, it's this: the truth is never convenient for those who have built their power on avoiding it. That's why it so rarely appears in full view. Most of the time, it's chipped away in back rooms, smothered under procedure, buried under polite language. But when it finally breaks into the open, it doesn't knock, it kicks the door off its hinges. That is what Jasmine brought into that chamber, not a request for permission, but a refusal to pretend. And in doing so, she showed that the smallest crack in the dam can flood the whole valley. All it takes is one person willing to strike it. Her stand also exposed another truth. One people don't like to admit: institutions are not self-correcting. Left to their own devices, they will protect themselves, not the public. Change doesn't seep in from the top. It surges up from those who are willing to bear the weight of pushing. That's why moments like this matter so much. They remind us that waiting for someone else to fix it is a fantasy. The someone else is us. And every time someone like Jasmine stands up, it shifts the scale just enough to make it easier for the next person to do the same. Courage is contagious, but only if it's visible. It's easy to romanticize this kind of moment, to treat it like a Hollywood script where the music swells and everything is fixed by the credits. But the real lesson is grittier. Speaking truth to power doesn't guarantee a win. It doesn't even guarantee survival. It guarantees resistance. It guarantees you'll be targeted, discredited, and if they can manage it, erased. But it also guarantees that someone else somewhere will see you and realize they are not alone, that they too can speak, that the cost of silence may be higher than the cost of standing up. And once that seed is planted, no headline can pull it back out. What Jasmine did was not just an act of defiance, it was an act of invitation. She didn't tell people to follow her, she showed them they could lead themselves. That's the human heartbeat under the political spectacle. It's why this clip will survive long after its news cycle has expired. Because it's not just about a speaker and a congresswoman. It's about every moment in every life where the choice is between staying quiet or breaking the room open with the truth. Those moments come for all of us, and they rarely announce themselves in advance. The question is never whether we'll have them, it's whether we'll be ready when they come. And maybe the clearest takeaway from that day is, this power is not about who speaks the loudest, but who refuses to be silenced. The stage, the cameras, the title plates on the desk, those are just props. What matters is what you're willing to say when every force in the room wants you to shut up. That's what Jasmine understood. That's why for one frozen moment, she made the most powerful man in the room the quietest. And that's why the lesson from that moment isn't locked in Washington. It's something every person can carry into their own battles, no matter how small they seem. The hush that followed wasn't just a pause, it was a fault line running under the floor, shifting the room's weight from one side to the other. What Jasmine had done was more than win an exchange. She had broken the spell that lets powerful men believe the rules bend for them alone. The lesson was already there, etched in the air like smoke after a gunshot. But a lesson means nothing if it sits there as a trophy. It has to be carried forward. It has to be used. And that's the dangerous beauty of moments like this. They're not built for applause. They're built to force a choice. Not the kind you can dodge with polite words, but the kind that follows you home, rattling around until you either act or admit you're choosing silence. Because the truth is not a spectator sport. It's a contact fight, and whether you realize it or not, you're already in the ring. The only question is whether you let someone else throw all the punches. This is where the message hits bone. The walls that protect corruption are not built by shadowy figures in back rooms. They're built in plain sight, one brick at a time, by ordinary people who decide comfort is worth more than confrontation. Every time someone swallows a truth to keep the peace, another brick slides into place. Every time a lie gets a free pass because it's not my fight, the mortar between those bricks hardens. Jasmine's stand was a hammer blow to that wall, but one hammer swing doesn't bring it down. It takes thousands swung again and again from every angle until the cracks join up and the structure gives way. And those swings don't just happen in courtrooms or under marble domes. They happen in office meetings, school hallways, factory floors, and kitchen tables. They happen anywhere someone in power believes the people in the room will look away. We've been told all our lives to wait for the right time to speak, when the risk is lower, when the room is safer, when the odds are better. But the truth doesn't work on a schedule. It sours in silence. And by the time that right time finally arrives, the damage is already cemented into place. That's why people like Mike Johnson use delay like a weapon stall, run down the clock until outrage fades. The only way to break that pattern is to cut in before the clock runs out. To speak when the danger is real, to stand when the room turns cold, to act while the cost is high. Because the minute you wait for safety, you've given the other side exactly what they need: time. This fight was never just about Washington. It's about the boardroom where promotions are bought, not earned. It's about the traffic stop where the badge serves fear before justice. It's about the school complaint shoved in a drawer because it might hurt the district's reputation. These are the smaller capitals we live inside every day, each with its own version of silence and surrender. And if one of them falls, it can set off a chain reaction either toward collapse or toward change. Jasmine's moment was a flare shot high into a night sky, but a flare dies out unless other lights answer it. That answer doesn't have to be as loud or as public, but it has to be just as unshakable. It has to be someone deciding in their own corner of the world, not here, not anymore. Here's the part most people don't want to face. Power is rarely stolen in one move. It's given away in pieces. Every compromise, every shrugged off injustice, every "that's just how it is" feeds it. And the longer it feeds, the harder it is to starve. That's why moments like this must be more than a story you repeat to friends. They have to be fuel. Fuel for the argument you've been afraid to start. Fuel for the stand you've been too tired to take. Fuel for the belief that the fight is not already lost. Because the second you decide it's hopeless, you've already handed the keys back to the very people you claim to oppose. So here's the call, sharp, clean, and impossible to miss. Stop waiting. Stop assuming someone else will step up. Stop thinking your voice is too small to matter. Every system standing today is built on the quiet compliance of those it governs. Break that compliance. Speak. Act. Challenge. Because the only thing worse than losing is never stepping into the fight at all. Maybe years from now, the headlines will be buried under newer scandals. Maybe the clips will collect dust in some digital archive. But there will still be one image that refuses to fade, a woman in a chamber full of power, looking its highest officer dead in the eye and refusing to yield. Her words will still echo. If you think the truth is garbage, then maybe you've never made a law. You've only bought yourself more time before the collapse. Don't let that line be reduced to a soundbite. Let it be a warning, a dare, and a map. Because the collapse she spoke of is not carved into fate, it's carved by our choices. Every day, each of us moves it closer or pushes it further away. And every day we decide which side of that line we're standing on. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.